In this video, we will discuss the transatlantic slave trade and its impact on the world. The first Europeans arrived in West Africa in the 1400s. Before this time, there had been advanced and powerful civilizations in this part of the world. West Africans had become wealthy by trading with Arabs from North Africa and the East. Their societies were highly advanced. There was strong political control, and they had powerful armies. Slavery was part of everyday life in African society long before European traders went to Africa. West African tribes enslaved captives when they conducted wars and raids against one another. This was one way of producing wealth in Africa, and slaves became symbols of wealth. Some of these slaves were criminals or people who had not paid their debts. Between 1235 and 1645, about one-third of the population of Mali had been enslaved. The suitable climate and soil in the southern states of North America made it possible for farmers to establish huge plantations of tobacco, cotton, rice, indigo, and sugarcane. There was an enormous need for raw materials, which could not be grown in Britain because of its unsuitable climate. Therefore, Britain looked to America to supply all its raw materials. Work on the large cotton, rice, sugar, and tobacco plantations was labor-intensive. Plantation owners started using slave labor because it was more profitable for them to own and control their own workers. Africans captured and enslaved people during tribal wars and raids. They were then chained around the neck and forced to march hundreds of kilometers to the west coast of Africa. The captured Africans were kept in prison-like forts until a slave ship arrived. The African traders then sold their captives to European slave traders. The slaves were taken to America on a slave ship. On this journey, they suffered under the most terrible conditions. It was known as the Middle Passage. Slaves were then auctioned like cattle. Their teeth and eyes were examined to see if they were healthy. Young, strong, or pretty slaves fetched high prices, and slaves who had previously worked on plantations and had skills such as building, carpentry, and cooking, or those who could read and write, sold very well. The slave trade was one leg of a bigger economic triangle. European powers took slaves to the American colonies from Africa and the Caribbean. Raw agricultural produce from the plantations on which the slaves worked were then transported to Europe. European countries then exported the goods made from raw agricultural produce back to the American colonies. There were different kinds of slaves on the plantations. The top positions were held by cooks, house cleaners, babysitters, washerwomen, and carriage drivers. These slaves worked inside the houses and out of the harsh weather. Most slaves worked very hard in the fields from sunrise to sunset 6 days a week. They were looked after by strict overseers who usually had whips in their hands. Slaves had no rights and very few possessions. Slave masters gave slaves new names and branded their bodies. They were also not allowed to practice their traditional religions. If a slave talked back to the master, did not work hard enough, or was caught in a fight, he or she would be punished in various ways. To get away from the boredom of repetitive work, the slaves sang songs that became known as Negro spirituals. These songs were based on Bible stories about hope, freedom, and a better future. They were expressions of religious faith and of the slaves' struggle to survive the harsh conditions of their lives on the plantations. It was important to slaves to feel as though they were able to put up some resistance to their harsh conditions on the plantations. They resisted in non-violent ways such as sluggishness, passivity, or indifference. Some also resisted in more violent methods such as arson, suicide, or even murdering their owners. Some individuals stood out among others, their rebellion leaving a mark on history. Nat Turner was a religious slave who often received visions. He saw an eclipse, and convinced that it was a sign from God, he and 70 other slaves escaped. They went from house to house, killing the white plantation owners and their families. Nat Turner and his group were eventually caught and executed. A Spanish slave ship called the Amistad left Cuba bound for America with a crew and 49 slaves. Joseph Cinque, a slave who had been trained in metalwork, found a file and was able to free himself and the other slaves. Cinque and the slaves took control of the ship and ordered the sailors to take them back to Africa. The sailors tricked them, and after 63 days at sea, they arrived at America's coast. They were eventually caught, imprisoned, and tried. To everyone's great surprise, the slaves won the court case and were set free. Harriet Tubman was a former slave who was determined to help other slaves to freedom. She was nicknamed Moses because she brought more than 300 slaves to freedom in North America and Canada over 19 secret trips. During the American Civil War, she became a spy for the North against the South, and she worked tirelessly to start rest homes for the poor. Harriet stood up for the rights of women. She died at the age of 93, having given her life to loving and helping others. Harriet Tubman had a friend called John Brown who was passionate about ending slavery through violence. His house was burnt down and his son killed by people who wanted slavery maintained. He led an unsuccessful slave rebellion in which he raided the state armory at Harper's Ferry, hoping to get guns for the slaves. He was hanged for treason, but he became a noble martyr. The Underground Railroad was an informal network of secret routes and safe houses used by escaping slaves. Many of the slaves wanted to run away from the plantations but had nowhere to go and were afraid that soldiers would capture and kill them. A secret route called the Underground Railway was started to help runaway slaves get to the northern states of America, where they would be free because slavery did not exist there. Whites who were against slavery allowed runaway slaves to use their homes as safe shelters called stations. Brightly lit candles in the windows would show runaways that a house was a station. Runaway slaves were called passengers, and the people who led them along roads and through forests were called conductors. The Transatlantic Slave Trade was a triangular system in which goods were transported by ship, mainly between three countries. Slavery affected the African economies as the labor of thousands of young, strong people was lost to the West African economy. The ongoing wars and raids in which slaves were captured also caused political instability. The whole economy of America benefited. Slave owners invested their wealth into making roads, railway lines, and increasing the number of slave ships. Slavery also created a large, weak economic underclass, and these people had to be cared for. Because of the fact that the members of this class were African, this situation further encouraged racism. Britain's income came from taxing goods from the transatlantic slave trade. This resulted in the Industrial Revolution, and the British economy changed forever. The slave trade had a ripple effect, and many people, such as shipping companies, plantation owners, and bankers, became very wealthy. The need for factories to manufacture goods also created new jobs for many people.